Over the last 7 weeks, we took the 25 custom archetypes showcased on this channel up to this point, plus 5 more decks based on iconic monsters from the original Yu-Gi-Oh series, and held a tournament called the Grand Prix. In addition to the fun of watching which one would come out on top and seeing these custom decks in action, this was also an opportunity to showcase the custom format that I creatively refer to as the custom card game, or CCG for short. The CCG is meant to serve as a format where people can not only use the custom cards shown on this channel in a format dedicated to it, but a format that strives to resolve a lot of the issues in the TCG and OCG. Other alternative formats exist of course, like GOAT or Edison, but the CCG keeps up with the modern aspects of the game while also paying tribute to legacy cards. The Grand Prix was the proof of concept of the CCG, and to recap the rules that made the CCG unique: A. It was a composite of the TCG and OCG ban list from December 2023, applying the maximum restriction on a card from both lists. B. A main deck cannot use cards from another archetype, though some cards may belong to multiple archetypes. C. Can't summon monsters from the extra deck except archetype-specific ones. And D. No hybrids. These rules weren't plucked out of thin air. They are based on a study of various concepts that make up Yu-Gi-Oh! And other similar card games. Not trying to say this channel is a reincarnate of Duel Academy, but classes in session, slide for slackers. This video marks the start of the Card Game Theory series where on a monthly basis, I'll discuss various card game concepts in detail. And to start that discussion is what I've learned from the Grand Prix. To recap some key stats of the Grand Prix, there were a total of 30 decks and 10 rounds of Swiss, followed by playoffs with the top 12 decks qualifying. As a result, we had 162 total matches, 150 in the Swiss rounds and 12 more in the playoffs, and this accounted for 416 duels. The average duel lasted 7.3 turns, that's total turns of both players, so basically meaning the average duel ended on either player's 4th turn. In the playoffs, this number jumped to nearly 10 turns. Obviously, it's a much smaller sample size prone to the swings of extremes, but even the median when adjusted for average match length is 9.6 turns per duel. It's worth noting that even though the playoff sample deals with the strongest decks, the turn count didn't shrink. The average match meanwhile lasted 2.55 duels in the Swiss and 2.75 duels in the playoffs, so in both instances, matches were going to 3 games over half the time. The playoffs having a higher likelihood of game 3s may indicate that while the playoff pool is closer to even in strength, there are some stragglers in the overall pool that often get 2-0 during the Swiss rounds. The home team won 48% of matches and 49% of duels. Home is defined as the player that goes first. This is about as close to 50-50 as you can get. In the playoffs, home teams won 58% of matches and 45% of duels, so again, pretty close when it comes to who wins between duelist who goes first versus duelist who goes second. The reason I tracked these statistics was not only to measure the performance of each deck in order to iterate them further, but also to learn how the format looks as a whole. These statistics allow me to quantify certain card game theories, such as how many decks or strategies is ideal in a format, how short or long are duels, and how critical is first mover advantage, i.e. going first. These concepts and more will be discussed in detail over time. The final takeaways I want to share are based on how the official Grand Prix compared to the practice one. This was mentioned briefly during the Lajin vs. Apophis playoff match, but we did run a few simulations prior to the official. 3 of these were before we had all 30 decks set, but once we had 30, there were 4 test runs prior to the official. This maniacal testing that involved 648 more matches served as an effective way to measure how balanced each deck was. From an overall stat standpoint, you can see that the match and turn counts tick up from test 1 to official, indicative of how these iterations corrected some of the OP decks that could end duels consistently without a fair fight. Obviously, turn count isn't an end-all KPI to measure length of duels because as we see in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, turns can last super long, but as you can see from the feature matches posted, decks in the CCG typically don't pull off endless combos. Yet the average match length, in terms of time, if I had to ballpark it, would be around 25 minutes. As for actual deck performance, in the first 2 simulations, Lajin won handedly, so this was an example of a deck that needed major pullbacks, and even then, still won the 3rd simulation. The 3rd simulation was also the first one after the announcement of the new Gate Guardian support, which saw it take the top seed. Gate Guardian also took the top seed in the official run, but didn't make the playoffs at all in the 4th practice, which brings me to the main takeaway of comparing these 5 runs, and that is what was each deck's best, worst, and average finish, and how often did each make the playoffs. It goes without saying, but it is extremely difficult to make 30 decks that are exactly even with each other, and these 5 runs prove that out by showing how some decks are consistently in the playoffs like Lajin, some decks are consistently in the bottom 10 like Chaos Emperor, and some have the potential to go both ways like Diabound, who was the bottom ranked deck in the 1st simulation, yet the 2nd ranked in the official with minimal corrections made to it along the way. The goal of the Grand Prix was to see if every deck would fall between 3 and 7 match wins or a dual win percentage between 30 and 70, and and that was accomplished by the time of the official run. The long-term goal with the CCG format is to balance decks so equally such that any deck can make the playoffs and any deck can end up on the bottom. Obviously, we've still got some work to do in that regard. So this analysis provides good direction on how to errata the high performers and create more custom support for the low performers. Stay tuned for booster supports for some of these decks. So those are some of the main takeaways of the Grand Prix and the greater CCG format. Again, a lot of concepts that these KPIs measured and more will be further explored in future videos. If you have a card game concept you'd like to see discussed on this channel, let me know in the comments, and I do emphasize the word discussed. I would love for duelists such as yourself to provide your own thoughts and inputs on what makes a card game great and what requires fixing so we can turn the CCG into a format that works for as many people as possible. Look forward to hearing from you all.